I first saw the photograph on a rain-worn October afternoon in 2018, while cataloguing a stack of wartime estate donations for the Lincolnshire Historical Archive. The boxes had been delivered from an old farmhouse outside Market Rayson, one of those sprawling rural properties sold after decades of neglect, the sort of place that leaves behind more dust than documents. Most of the contents were typical post-war relics: ration books, domestic ledgers, Ministry of Food notices, and the usual fading letters that families can't bring themselves to throw away, but have long since stopped reading. Then, at the bottom of one box, wrapped in a torn scrap of waxed cloth, I found the photograph. It was a large format print, roughly 8 by 10 inches, mounted on brittle card. A family of 9 posed before a plain backdrop, the kind used by traveling photographers in the early part of the century. The image had the strange amber tint of aged albumen prints, though the penciled note on the back read, "Taken July 1944. That discrepancy alone caught my attention. By the 1940s, photography had moved beyond the laborious chemistry of the previous era. Whoever took this picture was either nostalgic or working with very outdated materials. I set it under the magnifying lamp. The father sat front left, an older man with a weathered beard and a walking stick clutched between his knees. His wife, stout and severe, sat beside him, her dress buttoned high at the neck. Behind them stood a line of children and grandchildren, their expressions stiff, unsmiling, bound by the discipline of the camera. The smallest figure sat between the grandparents, a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, in a pale dress with a checked sash. Her face was slightly blurred, as if she had turned her head mid-exposure. Nothing unusual, I thought. Children rarely held still in long shutter photographs. Yet something about the blur unsettled me. It wasn't motion. It was distortion, an inconsistency in how light touched her compared to the others. I leaned closer. Her eyes were indistinct, the features faintly doubled, but it was the outline of her mouth that disturbed me most. The others had the fine grey tone typical of faded silver emulsion, but the child's lips appeared darker, almost wet-looking, as though some moisture had been caught in the chemical fix. The more I studied it, the more it resembled the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not innocent, not quite human. I logged the image as unknown family, 1944, rural Lincolnshire, possible. Then I slipped it into a plastic sleeve, intending to revisit it once the rest of the box was catalogued. That night, though, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something in that child's face lingered in the mind the way certain dreams do, shapeless but heavy, insisting on attention. I told myself it was professional curiosity. After all, the photo had no attribution, no studio mark, not even a photographer's pencil line. Whoever took it wanted anonymity, and that, in historical work, often means there's a story buried behind the image. The next morning, I scanned the photograph using the archive's flatbed. The high-resolution enlargement revealed details that the naked eye could not: threads in the fabric, faint scratches across the card, and most disturbingly, a subtle inconsistency in the shadows. The light source appeared to fall from the right, illuminating the father's hand, but the child's face reflected light from the opposite direction, as though there had been another lamp, another presence, casting illumination back toward her. I increased the contrast. That was when I noticed something else. Behind the family, in the depth of shadow where the plain backdrop should have been uniform, a faint circular pattern emerged. Not a stain, not a printing flaw. It was the outline of another head, faint, too large, almost invisible until one saw it, and then impossible to unsee. I printed the enlargement and took it to my supervisor, Professor Helen Dray. She specialized in mid-century vernacular photography and had a knack for finding the oddities that hide in domestic history. When I handed her the image, she frowned. 1944, you say? She asked, turning the card in her hands. Yes, though the process looks 20 years older. She held it under the light. Where did this come from? Estate donation. The catalogue lists a Mrs. Elspeth Ray, deceased. Apparently her grandfather was the man in the photo. Dre nodded absently, eyes still fixed on the print. And the girl? I don't know. The record lists 8 Rays in the census. This would make 9. Perhaps a neighbor's child. Perhaps. But we both knew that wasn't likely. The way the adult's hands rested, the grandmother's palm pressed lightly on the girl's shoulder, suggested kinship. She belonged to them in some way. Dre looked again, her brow furrowing. Do you see it? She whispered. I nodded. The shadow. She said nothing more, only slid the photograph back across the table. Don't file this yet, she said. Find out who took it. Over the next few weeks, I tried. The name Ray was common in Lincolnshire, but a note on the box referred to St. Leonard's Parish, Hatherby. I visited the local records office there, a cold, narrow room lined with the smell of mildew and old paper. The clerk, a woman in her 70s, brought me the parish register. There, in spidery handwriting, I found them. Edward Ray, born 1876, D. 1958. Mary Ray, born 1881, D. 1951. Children: Thomas, Alice, Lydia, Rebecca, Edwin, and Grace. But below Grace's name, added faintly in pencil rather than ink, was another. Annie, deceased, 1938. That couldn't be right. The photograph was dated 1944, yet there she was, a small note, age recorded as 6. I checked the burial index. Annie Ray, buried 8th February 1938. Cause of death: influenza complications. Grave located in Hatherby Churchyard, unmarked. I remember sitting there, staring at that entry for several minutes, before quietly closing the register. Back at the archive, I compared the census photographs we had of the Ray family, supplied years earlier for a wartime exhibition. They matched. Every face, the father, the mother, the older children, aligned perfectly. The only inconsistency was the girl. In 1944, she should not have existed. That evening, I returned to the scan. I zoomed further into the child's face until the pixels bled into one another. The edges of her features were sharp, too sharp for a blur caused by motion. Someone had altered the exposure. The emulsion surrounding her seemed layered, darker in density than the rest of the plate. I toggled through the infrared filters our lab used for damaged negatives. The background blackened. The child's outline remained. And behind her, faint but undeniable, another form appeared. It looked like the faint profile of a second face, pressed against her shoulder from behind. I stared at the screen, feeling my heartbeat quicken. The face was too indistinct to belong to anyone specific, neither male nor female, young nor old. But it was there, a shape within shadow, an echo of light fixed where no light should have fallen. The scan printer began to whir softly, though I hadn't pressed anything. The machine spat out a single image, a negative version of the photo, though I hadn't requested inversion. On the negative, the faces of the adults were pallid, ghostly white, but the child's face was black, a void. When I turned off the scanner, I could have sworn the hum of its motor continued for several seconds after the power light died. I visited Hatherby the next weekend. The churchyard was small, overgrown, and slick with autumn rain. I found the Ray graves clustered together, 8 stones in all, each simple and unremarkable. No marker for Annie, just as the register had said. But near the base of the father's stone, half buried in moss, something caught the light. I crouched and brushed away the soil. A fragment of photographic card, brittle with moisture, lay pressed into the earth. The surface was too degraded to make out details, but the shape was familiar. the blurred outline of a face, child-sized. I took it with me, wrapped carefully in tissue. That night, back at my flat, I left it on my desk beside the original photograph. I told myself I'd examine it the next day under proper conditions. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 in the morning, a faint crackling sound woke me. It took me a moment to realize it came from the direction of the desk, the soft, dry pop of old paper flexing. I turned on the lamp. The photo was where I'd left it, but the plastic sleeve had fogged slightly from the inside, as though moisture had condensed within. And on the card's surface, where before there had been only sepia stillness, the child's blurred face now seemed fractionally clearer. Her eyes were open. By morning, the fog inside the plastic sleeve had vanished, but the change in the photograph remained. I told myself it was an optical trick, that overnight humidity had altered the emulsion, deepening contrast where the light had been uneven. Still, I couldn't bring myself to slip the photograph back into its file. Instead, I placed it face down beneath a stack of archival notes, as if the simple act of hiding it could neutralize its unease. At the archive, I decided to trace the photographer. The back of the mount bore a faint embossed stamp, almost worn away. G. Whitaker Studio, Grantham. The name meant nothing to me, so I checked the regional directories from the period. There it was, George Whitaker, Photographic Services, active 1935 to 1952. Most of his work, I learned, had been portraiture for soldiers' families before deployment. There was little record of his personal life beyond a short obituary. Found deceased, 1953, in his studio following a suspected gas leak. No relatives survived him. I tracked down the property, now a second-hand bookstore. The owner, a tall man named Stewart, agreed to let me see the basement where the darkroom had once been. The space still smelled faintly of old chemicals, even decades later. Stacked along one wall were several wooden crates, relics from the building's past life. "Most of this came with the shop," Stewart said. "We've never had reason to go through it. But if you're with the archive, you're welcome to look." Inside one crate were dozens of glass plate negatives wrapped in yellowing paper. Many were cracked. I held each up to the light, expecting nothing. Soldiers, children, families, the everyday sorrow and pride of wartime England. Then I found one labeled Ray, July 1944. The negative matched the photograph perfectly. Same arrangement, same faces, same child. But there was a second plate directly behind it, identical except for one subtle difference. In the second exposure, the little girl was missing. The adult stood with the same grim solemnity, the same light. But the space between the grandparents was empty. My stomach tightened. The handwriting on the wrapping was shaky, hurried, and at the bottom of the label, Whitaker had written a single word: retake. I carried both plates upstairs into the light. "You all right?" Stewart asked when he saw my face. "Yes," I lied. "Just research." Back at the archive, I scanned both negatives at high resolution and compared them. The first, the one with the child, showed faint light bleeding into the emulsion around her figure, the same distortion I'd seen before. In the second, the light pattern behind the adults was different, softer, almost relieved. I ran a spectral analysis on both. The results showed elevated silver halide density around the child's outline, consistent with double exposure. That would have been easy enough to dismiss, except for one thing. Whitaker's equipment didn't use that kind of layered film. He shot on single plates. For a double exposure to occur, the same plate had to be reinserted and exposed again, something deliberate, not accidental. If Whitaker had tried to manipulate the image, why label it retake? Why keep both? I looked up the photographer's death again. The gas leak had occurred in his studio in October 1953. Local papers described it as a tragic accident. But an unverified police note buried in the coroner's file, mentioned something odd. A stack of photographic plates found beside the deceased, all showing the same family group. The child's face appeared degraded in every print. That night, I called my supervisor. "Dre," I said, "I think you should see this." She arrived the next morning, still in her raincoat, hair uncombed. I showed her the scans, the two plates side by side. She was quiet for a long time. "This isn't just degradation," she murmured finally. "The light values are reversed here, around the child's head. Almost as if—" She hesitated. "As if something was reflecting light back into the lens." "Like a mirror?" I asked. "Or glass," she said softly. "But the exposure timing doesn't make sense. The child's image isn't overlaid, it's embedded." I asked her what she meant. "It's as though she's part of the emulsion," she said. "Not on it, in it." We sat in silence. The hum of the scanner filled the room like a low breath. Then Dre stood abruptly. "Seal them," she said. "Both plates. Don't touch them again." When she left, I ignored her instruction. 2 days later, I received an email from a local genealogist who had heard of my inquiries. She had found a wartime article mentioning the Ray family. The headline read, "Local Farmer's Tragedy. Child Lost in Barn Fire." The article was brief. It described how 6-year-old Annie Ray had perished in a blaze on the family property in February 1938. Her father was said to have tried to rescue her, but was pulled away by neighbors before the roof collapsed. That same summer, the Rays rebuilt the barn, and in July 1944, 6 years later, they sat for the photograph. I returned to the photo once more. This time, I looked beyond the family. The backdrop was crude, probably a sheet hung across the wall. But at the far edge of the image, just behind the grandmother's left shoulder, was a vertical line that didn't match the fabric pattern. It was too straight, too sharp. I boosted the contrast. It wasn't fabric, it was wood grain. The backdrop wasn't a studio sheet at all. It was a barn wall, and there, faint, just above the father's shoulder, were blackened scorch marks. That realization left me cold. Whitaker hadn't photographed them in a studio. He'd taken the image at the site of the tragedy. I turned to the parish records again. The vicar in 1944, a Reverend Hargreaves, had kept meticulous notes. His sermon entries were interspersed with personal reflections, fragments of thought that, together, painted a strange picture of that summer. June 18th, the Rays returned to service for the first time since the fire. They sat near the back. Mr. Ray looked thinner. He said they were having another portrait made, for closure. July 10th. Saw the children in the churchyard after dusk. Said they were tending Annie's resting place, though no flowers were laid. July 14th. Mrs. Ray came to me distressed. Said the girl's favorite dress was missing from the trunk where it had been kept. Asked if I'd seen any local children playing near the property. I told her no. And finally, July 23rd, a strange visitor at the rectory tonight. Mr. Whitaker, the photographer, said he'd seen something in his plate, something that shouldn't be there. He asked if the Rays had lost more than one child. I told him no. He left before nightfall. After that entry, the journal resumed its normal tone, as though nothing had happened. I couldn't leave it alone. I contacted Hatherby's local historian, a retired teacher named Margaret Foyle. When I mentioned the Ray photograph, she invited me to her cottage that same afternoon. Her sitting room smelled of dust and lavender, the walls lined with framed parish maps. "The Rays," she said, nodding gravely. "Yes, people here still whisper about them." "What sort of whispers?" She poured tea slowly, her hands trembling. "That they never really buried the child. That the coffin was empty." "Empty," I repeated. She nodded. "The barn fire burned too hot. There was little left to bury. Reverend Hargreaves said a prayer over the ashes and called it done. But she hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a brittle cutting from an old newspaper. It showed the same family, older now, the headline reading, "Local farmer dies suddenly, found in barn." The date, 1948. "Edward Ray," she said. "They found him inside the rebuilt barn. No fire this time. They said he'd been crushed under fallen timber, but there was talk of something else, that his face was wrong, twisted." Her voice dropped. "They said it looked like he'd been smiling." That night, back at my flat, I dreamed of the child. She stood at the edge of my vision, unmoving, her dress pale against the dark. In her hand she held something small and round, a charred wooden doll's head. When I woke, the photograph was once again lying face up on my desk, though I had left it locked away in a drawer. The child's face had changed again. The blur was gone. Her features were now perfectly clear, calm, composed, and unmistakably aware. Her eyes met mine with the faintest glint of reflected light, as if she could see through the camera and beyond it, into the present. I don't remember knocking the photograph to the floor, but I remember the sound it made, a dry slap, like skin meeting wood. In the weeks that followed, small things began to happen. The lights in the archive would flicker when I logged the photograph's file. The scanner's power button glowed faintly, even when unplugged. Once, alone in the darkroom, I heard a child's voice humming a simple tune, high and tuneless, the same melody that, I later discovered, was the refrain of a Lincolnshire lullaby printed in a 1930s children's primer. When I told Dre, she stared at me a long time. "You've been working too many hours," she said, but her tone wasn't scolding. It was fearful. The next morning, she requested to see the photograph again. I handed it to her in its sealed sleeve. She hesitated before sliding it out. "Look," she whispered. "The hands." I leaned closer. The grandmother's hands, which had rested on the child's shoulders in the earlier print, were now faintly misaligned, shifted slightly forward, as if gripping harder. Her fingers seemed to dig into the child's dress. Photographs don't change, not chemically, not without interference. But this one did. Dre sealed it again and placed it in the restricted archive drawer. "This never leaves the vault," she said. "Promise me." I promised. 2 months later, she was gone. Her car was found near the disused Whitaker studio. Inside, on the passenger seat, lay the photograph. The original, not the copy. How she'd retrieved it, I'll never know. The police called it an accident, an apparent carbon monoxide leak from the car's exhaust. But I saw the coroner's report. Her face, they wrote, bore a faint smile. I still have the scan on my personal drive. I've tried deleting it, but every time I check, the file reappears under a new name. Annie 1, Annie 2, Annie 3. The metadata lists its creation date as 1944. Sometimes, late at night when my computer is off, I hear the faint hum of the scanner again, that low mechanical breath from a machine that hasn't been powered in months. And in the dark reflection of the monitor, I sometimes catch the suggestion of a small pale face behind me. Blurred at first, then clear, as if time itself were refocusing its lens. The last time I looked, the child was closer. Her mouth had curved upward. Not quite a smile, not anymore.